The rain fell on Brussels that morning the way it always did, steady, patient, without apology. Lieutenant Columbo stood beneath the awning of a small cafe on the Rue des Pierres, watching the water sheet down the window and wondering, not for the first time in 5 years, whether he'd made the right choice leaving Los Angeles behind. He'd come to Brussels to disappear, to fade into the background like an old photograph left in the sun. His wife had wanted this: quieter streets, better chocolate, a life where nobody knew his name or his methods, or the way he'd driven half the LAPD to distraction with his rumpled suits and his innocent-sounding questions that somehow always landed like accusations. But disappearing, he was learning, was harder than it sounded. The call had come through his landlord that morning, a Belgian police captain named Devereaux, polite but strained, asking if the American living on Rue des Treves might be willing to consult on a matter. "Just observe," the captain had said. "Nothing official. The local detectives would handle everything. They simply wanted a second set of eyes, an outsider's perspective." Columbo had said yes before he really understood what he was agreeing to. The body belonged to Henri Marchand, one of Brussels' most celebrated art dealers, 53 years old, found at 7 a.m. by his assistant, slumped across his desk in the back office of his gallery, a bronze paperweight on the floor beside him. The cause of death was obvious: blunt force trauma. The motive, less so. Nothing had been stolen. The safe was intact. Marchand's wallet still held nearly 2,000 euros. Now Columbo stood in the gallery itself, his raincoat dripping onto the polished concrete floor, watching the Belgian detectives move through the space with the efficiency of men who'd already decided what they were looking at. Crime of passion, they'd concluded. Someone Marchand knew. Someone angry. The assistant, perhaps, though she'd been with him for only 6 months, or a disgruntled client. These things happened in the art world. Temperamental people, volatile relationships. Columbo listened and nodded, and tried to look like a man who agreed with them. But something was bothering him. Something small and wrong and just slightly out of place. He couldn't quite name it yet. It was the way the bronze paperweight was positioned, or perhaps the absence of something. A telephone that should have been on the desk but wasn't. Dust patterns that suggested furniture had been moved recently. Captain Devereaux approached him, a tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "What do you think, Lieutenant?" he asked, though his tone suggested he'd already decided what the answer should be. Columbo rubbed his chin and looked around the gallery at the paintings, modern abstracts, mostly, splashes of colour that didn't quite resolve into anything meaningful. "Beautiful space," he said finally. "Mr. Marchand must have been very successful." "Very successful indeed," Devereaux agreed. "Which is why this is almost certainly personal. A crime of passion." Columbo nodded slowly, but his eyes had found the telephone on a side table. It was turned face down. "Just one thing," he said quietly. "If I could ask, did Mr. Marchand receive a lot of calls?" Devereaux looked at him as if he'd asked whether water was wet. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Probably nothing," Columbo said. But he was already wondering. The face-down telephone stayed with Columbo as he left the Marchand residence. He sat in the back of the taxi, winding through Brussels' narrow streets, turning it over in his mind, like a coin with an unusual weight. Why would a man keep his phone turned face down unless he didn't want to see it? Unless he didn't want to be reminded of it? The Belgian police file sat on his lap, thin and unsatisfying. Robbery gone wrong, they'd concluded. Quick, brutal, efficient. But Columbo had learned long ago that efficiency in murder often concealed something messier beneath. The widow had been almost too composed, too rehearsed. She'd known exactly what to say about passion and jealousy, as if she'd practiced the words in front of a mirror. And yet she'd flinched, just slightly, when he'd asked about the telephone. His hotel was modest, the way he preferred them. He settled into the cramped room with a cup of weak coffee and began making calls. The Belgian authorities had been cooperative, if skeptical. They'd given him names, addresses, the usual suspects in Marchand's orbit. A rival dealer, a collector from Antwerp, the usual cast of characters in the art world's underbelly. But Columbo wasn't interested in the usual yet. He started with the telephone company. A woman named Isabelle, bored and efficient, confirmed that Marchand's line had received an average of 8 calls per day. Nothing unusual there. Except, and here Columbo sat up, there had been 3 incoming calls on the day of his death, all from blocked numbers. He requested the names anyway. It would take time, she said. It always did. The rival dealer was named Gérard Clément, and Columbo found him in a gallery near the Grande Place. The man was tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. They'd competed for the same clients, yes, but murdered? Clément laughed, a sound like ice in a glass. I didn't need to kill Marchand, he said. I was already taking his business. The man was careless, sloppy. He had connections he shouldn't have had. People don't like that. What kind of people? Columbo asked, scratching his head. The kind who don't like competition, Clément said, and then seemed to catch himself. Look, I don't know what you're implying, but if you want to understand Marchand, you should understand that he wasn't just moving paintings. Columbo felt something shift in the room, like a door opening. What was he moving? He asked gently. Clément stood and walked to a painting on the wall, a Bruegel, or something close to it. He didn't turn around when he answered. Everything. He was a collector's collector, but some of what he collected never made it into any catalogue. The drive back to his hotel took him past the cathedral, its spires sharp against the darkening sky. Columbo watched the city lights flicker on, one by one. Somewhere in this city, someone had known about those blocked calls. Someone had known what Marchand had been moving and why it was worth killing for. He was only beginning to understand the shape of it now. Somewhere in this city, someone had known about those blocked calls. Someone had known what Marchand had been moving and why it was worth killing for. Columbo sat in the hotel lobby the next morning, turning a paper cup of coffee in his hands. The liquid had gone lukewarm an hour ago, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, sorting through the pieces like a man arranging photographs on a table. The blocked calls, the art gallery owner who'd seen nothing, the customs official who'd been just a little too helpful, and De Bruyne, the museum director who'd mentioned the catalogue with the kind of casual precision that only came from having thought about it many times before. He'd spent half the night on his phone with the LAPD, asking questions about a man who'd been dead for 3 years. A consultant to the museum, a man De Bruyne had hired personally, a man with a record of moving things that weren't supposed to be moved. By 9 o'clock, Columbo was standing outside the museum. It was still early enough that the staff was just arriving, and he caught De Bruyne coming through the side entrance, a newspaper tucked under his arm. Marchand De Bruyne, Columbo said. I wonder if we could talk. In your office, maybe. Something flickered across the man's face. Not quite fear. Something more like recognition. The look of someone who'd been waiting for this moment and had finally heard the knock on the door. In the office, with the door closed, Columbo didn't sit down. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, and he spoke quietly. You knew about the shipments, the ones that came in under Marchand's name but went somewhere else. Your consultant, the one who died in California, he was the one who arranged it. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed someone on the inside, someone with access to the catalogues, the shipping documents, the ability to make things disappear from the records. De Bruyne's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his desk. That's not. When Marchand started asking questions, Columbo continued, when he started wondering why certain pieces weren't showing up in inventory, he became a problem. Your consultant had already moved on, but the arrangement continued. Someone else had to handle it, someone local, someone who understood the business well enough to keep it quiet. The silence that followed was the kind that only comes when the last refuge of denial has finally collapsed. De Bruyne looked at his hands as if they belonged to someone else entirely. "I didn't kill him," he whispered. "No," Columbo said, "but you knew who did, and you let it happen. That's the thing about retirement, sir. I thought I could step away from this work, thought I could let the world turn without me in it, but it doesn't work that way. Not when you know the truth, not when you see the shape of it." He pulled out his notebook and began to write. Outside, the city went about its morning, indifferent to the small confession happening in a museum office high above the Brussels streets